One of the things that I have learned from people who have been doing advocacy work for, their lives is that you have to do it in a way that feels sustainable to you. Perhaps you win, perhaps you don't. More often you probably lose and feel really discouraged and burned out. For this work to really build and grow the way we need it to, we need to be able to do it in a way that feels sustainable to each of us. Welcome to Nondriver.
Real stories of navigating our world from people who can't drive.
I'm Anna Zivarts.
And I'm Devin Silvernail. How are you doing today, Anna?
Doing good. Yeah. Excited to be talking with you and kicking off this podcast.
Yeah, this time around we get to flip the script. So for folks who tuned into our first episode, Anna was the person in the interviewer seat asking me about my pathway to this moment, and now it's my turn to ask Anna. I think a lot of folks, probably more folks who are listening to this, know who you are than know who I am. But for folks who are brand new to both of us, Anna Zivarts was also born with nystagmus, just like me. Anna started as a videographer and organizer at the ACLU, co-founded a worker-run video production company, which is so cool. And later worked as a communication strategist for labor and for political campaigns. In 2020, Anna launched the Disability Mobility Initiative, part of Disability Rights Washington. Also created the Week Without Driving challenge that kind of has gone, I feel, international now. And then obviously wrote this book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. And now is the founder of the Nondrivers Alliance and also co-host of the show. So Anna, you've done a ton of stuff in your advocacy life. It's pretty cool.
I have been lucky in that I've been able to make it work over the years, doing advocacy and doing advocacy for my job, which is, yeah, it's been cool. And, to be real, has often been supported by the fact that my partner works for a labor union and I get health care through that, and have been able to have a little bit more freedom to take on jobs and take on challenges like trying to start a nonprofit in this moment because of that healthcare security. So just want to call that out. Thank you, labor and good healthcare.
Still, not to take away all of that work that you've done, it is a lot of hard work. I just wanted to get started, though, kind of how you had asked me a couple questions. I want to ask you a couple questions up front. If you can give us really one example of how being a non-driver has affected you, just like me, there's a million examples. But if you can think of maybe sometime in your early life or in your early adulthood where, that really stood out for you, I think that'd be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I'm going to actually bring it back to labor for a second. So in college, I went to school in the Bay Area. And I got really involved with student labor organizing. So, students organizing in support of campus workers, and got hired during college as an organizer for SCIU, which was great. Taught me a lot of skills. This was even before like Google Maps or MapQuest. So I remember going out with like a road atlas, going, to do people's home visits, right, to talk to people. And the other part of it that was great was that I was able to pay for college while I was in college and didn't have to go into debt. I loved organizing. I love getting to talk to people. I love sort of building that sense of community solidarity and power. And in college, I was always partnered with other folks who could drive when we did home visits, and it wasn't, we were going out as pairs anyway, so it was fine. And I really wanted to be an organizer. And the unions were like, well, you can't drive. I don't think you can be an organizer. Why don't you become a researcher? And so I, went to a researcher training, and I got hired as a researcher. And I realized right away that like sitting behind a computer all day and not connecting with people just sucked my soul dry. It was not not a happy place for me to be in. There wasn't really a space for me without a driver's license in this sort of like model of organizing that involved, driving around to people's houses and talking to them. And so, I think that's one point at which my life shifted, and that's, essentially why I ended up in communications, because it required less of the in-person visits to people's homes, but involved at least, some amount of engagement with human beings. And so that's, that shaped the direction of my life in a big way.
That touches on a big point for a lot of people. I think that for me personally, and I'm sure for you, how many jobs that you've overlooked when you were looking for a job that said like it required a driver's license?
So I was actually hired as a researcher and moved to New York City for a job, as a researcher there. And then at that point, not having a license just became less of a thing, because in New York City, it just was never a question in job interviews. At least not for the sort of, like white collar, job interviews, communication job interviews that I was, going for. I think that the sort of the flip side of that is that I was so ashamed of my disability at that point. And growing up, like I didn't want to tell people, and so I wouldn't tell people in these interviews. And I think then they, there was enough. Something was off, right? Where they could tell that something was different about me, and they couldn't quite understand what it was. And so, I think that wasn't actually very helpful. Me trying to not to hide it, right?
When would you say that you kind of decided to make that more well known, and why did you decide to make that decision?
I mean, I really tried to hide it. Like this was through my 30s, right? Because I ended up, doing political campaign work, and then as sort of YouTube and Facebook video became a thing, went into video production, because I had done some video, production and film editing classes in school, and I was doing freelance work, and I was like, no one's gonna hire, a low vision filmmaker, right? Like, why would you hire someone who can't see to make videos? And so I was like really, really secretive about it, right? As, with clients. Once people got to know me, and I started doing a lot of work for unions around the country, they knew that I couldn't drive. And so it was always sort of a like, well, if I'm going to go to, Columbus, Ohio, like someone's going to have to pick me up at the airport, and drive me to the hotel and pick me up the next day. But it wasn't, a big deal. I also, was really into biking and the bike community, and got into bike racing a little bit. And while my closest friends in that space, and my teammates and my coach knew that my vision, knew about my vision, I was encouraged not to tell anybody else, because people were worried that, how the rest of the biking community would react to that. And so I was really sort of deep in the closet, so to say. So 2016 came along, and my kid was born in November that year, right before the election. Uh, and he, shortly after being born, was diagnosed with the same eye condition I have. And that was just this like shattering moment for me. I had this like, deep emotional reaction, a lot of sadness, couldn't stop crying. And like, I mean, postpartum is an emotional time for everyone, but it was, it was really hard. And it actually got connected, started realizing that like my sadness wasn't really about him, but about my own childhood, and like both, yeah, still emotional to talk about. And so I got connected to Lighthouse for the Blind, and started seeing a social worker there who was just amazing. And over the course of 6 months or so, started sort of processing that those feelings, and realized that like, gosh, there was this whole community out there that I hadn't been connected to, and that I needed to. And so um at that point, I started sort of trying to figure out ways like, how do I fit into the disability community? Who out there is speaking in ways that resonates with who I am, and the way I see the world? And, I think I had sort of like poked around disability groups a little bit, and wasn't, I mean, for lack of a better word, but wasn't seeing a lot of sort of intersectionality around race or class. And that felt really missing to me. I remember in college, I went briefly to like a student disability group on campus and looked around, and it was, 100% white. And I was like, this is strange. Like, this doesn't feel like a space I necessarily like. Why is this way? And I only went to that one meeting, and part of that was my own, internalized ableism. But part of it was also like, this is not the kind of space that reflects the kind of community that I want to, be part of. And so, yeah. Eventually on Twitter, I found Alice Wong, who passed recently, but was just like an amazing, amazing leader and thinker and organizer and connector in the disability community, through her work and her writing, Disability Visibility Project. And that sort of vision of the disability community was like, okay, this is it. This is a place where I can see myself, uh, yeah, being part of. And that eventually led me to finding a job at a disability rights organization that was trying to sort of break the mold a little bit with, the way they were doing advocacy, and move back to Washington State and start, doing work here.
Lighthouse for the Blind there is such a great resource. I remember being a kid, and I don't know how, but my parents connected me with them too, and that helped me to an extent kind of grapple with where my life was going to be headed. Um, and then, talking about our kids as well, I have a kid as well. And this last year she started wearing glasses, and I kind of had that kind of internalized guilt, because I thought, well, maybe this is my fault. Um, so I think that that's completely natural. But what I really wanted to touch on is it's very interesting because I think probably pretty common with people who get into organizing, this idea that you kind of do, you both choose this path, and this path chooses you, right? It seems like, you had this idea of what you wanted to do, but then there was this kind of detour that you had to take, and then you followed that detour, and you kind of became deeper and deeper, more interested in that work, which led to more work, which led to more work. And I just find that really, really interesting, that common thread, that it just kind of, it almost feels like a happy accident, which makes you think about, you writing this book. Did you always think that you wanted to write a book, or was this another one of these happy accidents? Um, and I mean, do you see your writing as another form of organizing, or this
Oh,
book as an
totally.
organizing tool?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, it's funny. I didn't, I was never considered myself like a writer or an author. Like that wasn't something that I aspired to. I definitely, always saw myself as a communicator, doing a lot of video communication, figuring out how to share stories, to create impact. And really like what I realized pretty early on in the communication working I was doing with a lot of organizing was that often, while it was great for other people to see a story, a video that you created with someone, telling their story, what was actually often most impactful was the experience of that person, being able to tell their story and then feeling sort of bought into this work and bought into the movement, for lack of a better word, or the campaign, the project. And so, having storytelling being an organizing tool. And that's what I set out with initially, when I started doing transportation organizing work in Washington in 2020. Let's ask people to share their stories as a way to sort of bring them into this cohort of people who then see themselves as being able to impact the way policy and budgets and this narrative around whose mobility counts. Let's sort of bring that piece in. And so it was really a storytelling project. That was sort of the initial form of the book in many ways was a story map that I created when I was working at Disability Rights Washington. We interviewed over 300 people, and then documented those stories in this story map. And that, I was like, wow, this is cool. Hadn't seen that sort of work happening around disability and transportation, and wanted to figure out how to, get the message out beyond sort of the audience that we could, with this interactive website. A book sort of grew out of that, wanting to share those stories. And then also there was a big piece around like, a book is considered like a legitimate form of knowledge, right? There's like a lot of yeah, I guess legitimacy that comes from something being in a book, for better or for worse. And so wanting to have what was these experiences and this knowledge of the disability community and of non-drivers seen as valid, seen as valuable, seen as expertise. And one way to do that was to sort of, leverage my ability to convince a publisher to turn this into a book, into, having this knowledge be seen as real. And so that was sort of the desire behind writing the book. In the process of writing it, I realized I really do enjoy writing. And so I'm hoping to work on another book soon, spending more time in that writing process because it's something that I enjoy. But I didn't go into this thinking that I wanted to be a writer.
It's great that there are people out there that want to gather that knowledge and bring it together. And it's funny because, I look at your book and I also kind of think about it as an organizing tool. In fact, on my bookshelf here, I have it's divided into a couple of of different sections, and I do have this organizing inspiration section, and it's one of the books that I turn to. And I think you're right, because especially when you can turn to a page, open a page and look at something tangible, not only can you feel that and see that and touch that, you can share that with somebody else. It's such a great tool. And so I think that's really cool that you see it that way, because not sure if many authors do. And for the folks, again, for folks that think of organizing as one thing or another, there's so many different forms, especially sharing stories, because stories are so powerful. I'm wondering, after interviewing all these people, I think you talk to people across the United States. um was there kind of a pattern or one specific theme that you kind of ended up seeing coming from these different stories? Is kind of, if it were a Venn diagram, is there an overlap that you see whenever you're talking to anybody?
I think one theme that, hadn't really been surfaced in a lot of the transportation conversations, that was sort of a common current through a lot of the stories, is what it felt like to have to rely on other people, to get places. And while that can be, really nice sometimes, and I was talking to someone at an event recently who was sharing that they had read, a story about someone doing, not having a car as a way to build community, right? Like as a way to have to go out and like connect with other people for rides. For those of us who have, really can't drive and it's not a choice, non-drivers by default, as you say, like often that reliance on, our friends, our family, our social networks, on, professional caregivers, perhaps, can be really draining. And after, like there's this sort of like having to ask permission every time you want to go somewhere, because you have to convince this other person that your desire to travel is valuable and valid enough for them to spend their time doing it. And I think we don't talk enough about that, and recognize that enough. And I know like there's this tension, especially with when I think about my own family and my parents, I mean, even my partner too, like they're like, oh, well, we can just ask, we'll drive you. And it's like, well, it isn't like, sure, I can do that. But then I have to, sort of negotiate this with you, rather than just being able to make the trip that I want to make for whatever reason, whether it's a medical appointment or, just because I want to go out and go, get a coffee at this particular place. Like, um, yeah, I think that piece, was something that I heard again and again in interviews. And it can be, I mean, it can be just that feeling, right, of sort of like suppressing your desire to go places because you don't feel like asking for favors. But it can, escalate into situations, and it does for some people, right, where like you are having to rely on someone who, is abusive, or there's just like it's a dangerous situation that you can't get out of, because of that sort of dependence on, someone else. That's a theme that we don't recognize enough when we talk about the need for less car dependent communities.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. If you were to talk to any kind of person, any person who relies or can rely on a car to get around, and you told them that, I think that a lot of people would be surprised. Personally in my life, I've had folks that I've been really close to, that I've ended up, we ended up having arguments. I mean, some that are so bad that we really didn't talk to each other for a very long time, because the negotiation didn't, work out, right? So you start with oh, I can offer you gas money, or I can do it at this time, or whatever. And those are just things that folks don't necessarily, they don't have to think about when they can just go get up off their couch, walk to their car, and go literally anywhere in the world they want. Uh, I've watched YouTube channels where people drive from London to Beijing, right? Like
Yeah.
you can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's funny because I think I also sort of have, as a result of that, like developed this deep desire to travel places that like maybe other people don't have. And I think part of it is that like proving that I can do it without driving, right? Proving that I can, combine some epic number of buses and trains and biking and like, like modes that, to get somewhere, and that I feel a great sense of accomplishment in doing that. And I think there's also like when you're asking someone for a ride, and for me, like sometimes it's great to get to know someone, and long drives are a lovely way to know people deeper because you're sitting in a car and you're talking for hours. But that also, in some ways is draining. And there's times when I'm like, God, it would be great to not have to feel like I have to be turned on and performing gratitude for that many, hours. So I'm actually like, this is an example of this, but on Monday, in a few days, I have to go to a conference over on the eastern side of the state, over in Leavenworth, which is not an easy place to get to without driving. There is Amtrak service, but it's like daily and comes in weird hours, so I can't make it work, and there's no other transit. But I did hear from another non-driving friend that there's an airporter that can take me within 5 miles of where I need to be. And then there may be some local transit I can take for the last 5 miles. I think I'm also going to bring a folding bike. And I may need to bike on the state highway, Route 2, which isn't the most fun, but I think I can, 5 miles isn't that far. So, and I decided I was going to do this, even though I could, yes, probably get a ride, but it would mean leaving at times that aren't as convenient, staying longer than I wanted to, and just that sort of like needing to not only be at this conference and be, engaging with people, but, having to do that for, 18 hours of this day. And so I'm gonna try to hack it with the airporter. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's not just a negotiation with other people; it's a negotiation with yourself, within yourself, because you're thinking about that. You could take this Amtrak that I have parents that live in, or my family, lots of family actually, that lives in North Central Washington, and I've taken that Amtrak. I've taken the Wenatchee Valley Shuttle as well, and the shuttle is great. Honestly, it's much better than taking the train because the train is chronically 4 hours late. And Leavenworth as a city is really an interesting place because one block, or one one street is really cool and walkable, and then the rest of it is mountains. And so that makes it very hard. Crossing fingers for you. Luckily, it seems like a lot of people, especially along that route to, are used to, quote unquote cyclists, folks doing races and things of that nature. So hopefully that'll work out for you. But that's very interesting, and that makes you think about, would you say that this negotiation between within yourself and between yourself and other people, when you're in a room with folks who are making policy decisions, do you think that that is kind of the thing that never comes into the conversation, or would you say that that is just scratching the surface and there's so much more that they're missing?
We'd mentioned Week Without Driving a minute ago, but I feel like this is a place where Week Without Driving starts to help people understand a little bit about this experience, especially if they really commit to participating in the full week, and not just like, one bus trip or one bike trip. But, if you really are trying to not drive for a full week and trying to get and participate in your life the way you would want to, and normally, need to, I think you start to recognize some of these things, like what it feels like to ask for rides from coworkers or friends every time you want to go somewhere. What it feels like to, maybe not that it's dangerous, but like, uncomfortable waiting in a dark bus stop, in the evening, on, when there's just no one else around. One of the first years we did Week Without Driving, I remember getting a video reflection from a council member, Paula Ryan, who talked about how even after just a week, she felt like her mood was really like she felt a little blue, I think was the way she phrased it, because she had found that she was giving up social activities because she didn't feel like she could ask people for a ride to, a coffee shop or a ride out, for dinner. Like she felt okay asking for rides for, like work or medical appointments, but those social things were the things that, were just like a little too much to ask for, right? And you just think about what that, how that impacts people over a lifetime, not being able to participate as fully as, you know, we would like to if it was a little bit easier to get places, especially when you're in a community where everyone else can sort of get those places. Not everyone else, but everyone who can drive can get those places really easily, feeling left out, or, you know, feeling like you just can't participate as fully because that time commitment of travel or energy is just so much greater for you to you know, join the same activities.
A lot of these folks, these policymakers, perhaps that council member before she decided to participate in the week without driving, you know, you can hear about non-driver, and the immediate assumption could be, and it probably is, someone living a car-free lifestyle, right? You know, that nowadays, which is really great, right? The idea that folks are choosing to live by taking public transportation or biking or walking or whatever. But it seems that there can be a little bit of confusion between, you know, this car-free lifestyle and being a non-driver by default. Where are some points where you see that these two kind of parallel things can work in favor of one another? And then where do you see that notion could be not necessarily getting in the way of then, you know, the needs of non-drivers, but how that could be maybe potentially skewing people's perspective when they're doing that work?
This is, I think, like the root of so much of you know, what I think about. And I first of all, like, I, you know, I do want to recognize that it's not like a strict binary between voluntary or involuntary non-drivers, right? That, you know, there can be people who may have a driver's license, but like that cost of that extra tank of gas, right, is too much. Especially right now, we're seeing a lot of people sort of shifting away from car trips because of high gas prices. Or, you know, perhaps have an anxiety disorder or a chronic health condition where maybe driving is possible, but gosh, it's not very comfortable and it doesn't feel particularly safe. And so, unless it's an absolute emergency, you know, they're not going to get behind the wheel. Or, you know, maybe they could drive if they had a car that with like adaptive hand controls, but that's not something they can afford. And so, you know, they're a non-driver because of that cost piece, right? So understanding that there's like a continuum and a lot of complexity, but, you know, also recognizing that in advocacy spaces, especially, there's a lot of people who are really excited about the car-free lifestyle, and, you know, feel in some ways it's a sort of like moral superiority that comes across, right? Like, I'm car free and therefore, you know, I'm not, you know, killing the planet, and I'm, you know, living a healthier lifestyle. And it comes off as privilege, right? Because often there is a lot of privilege required to be able to set up your life in a way where being car free is convenient, right? Whether that's living in a place that has sidewalks or reliable transit, or bike lanes, or having, you know, the physical ability to bike, having, you know, not having particular caregiving responsibilities that make biking or taking transit, you know, trickier, right? And when we do have people who are in decision-making roles or in, you know, positions of power, in our agencies and government, who are sympathetic to reducing car dependency, often that experience comes from the place of being someone who is, you know, sort of a choice non-driver. And I think it's great, you know, that we have people who are wanting to reduce car dependency, right? Like, we need a bigger tent. We need a bigger coalition of people who want to have less car dependent communities. But I think it's important for some of the people who are making, who are, you know, car free by choice, to recognize that the choices they have are maybe choices that other non-drivers don't have, and things that work for them may not work for other non-drivers, and understanding that their experience isn't, you know, can't be the experience of everyone who is a non-driver, and that it's important to sort of bring in some of those other perspectives, experiences into decision making as well, so that we're designing systems, you know, that can work for a broader range of people. I think about, like, you know, for example, like shared bikes and scooters, and who those systems are designed for, right? And versus like the population of non-drivers more broadly that they could serve if they were designed differently, right? So like if you have a two-wheel, you know, scooters, you require you to be able to ride that kind of device, require you not to have kids or groceries. Like, you're excluding a lot of folks, right? It requires you to have a certain income to be able to pay $1 a minute for using them, right? Versus if you were to set up a system of shared micromobility that was designed to reach more people, especially more people who are excluded from car ownership or being able to drive a car.
I will invite you next time you come here to visit our shared mobility, micromobility, city-owned program.
Oh,
And they also
cool.
have adaptive cycles.
Ooh.
So yeah, it's great when you have policymakers that think about those kind of things.
Yeah.
And we have parking specifically in our garages for adaptive cycles and things like that too.
Oh my God. Yeah. Just
Um,
to shout out, like at your city hall, there was a parking spot in front of City Hall that was a disabled biking parking spot. And I was like, I took a picture of it because I was like mind blown. Yeah. That first of all, that there was like a visibility for disabled biking, like as a, like, oh yeah. Anyway. So yeah, not that it's not possible to design micromobility systems that do this. Like Lime Bike in Paris has bikes, kid seats on the back of some of their bikes. I think that's like really cool. There are low income, programs for some of these companies offer. In my neighborhood, Lime has a lot of has a low income program that's used by a lot of middle schoolers. I know the middle schoolers aren't supposed to be using it, but a lot of the Black and brown youth in South Seattle are active, active shared mobility users, and so there's demand for this, but the systems aren't necessarily set up or designed for the full spectrum of people who need to and want to use them.
I think you touched on something that I can personally say a lot of folks don't in the policy space don't think about. And that is this economically two sides of the same coin, right? So owning a car is very expensive. Owning a car in Seattle, at least as of 2 years ago, the average household in Seattle had 1.5 cars. And so that pretty low for the United States. But that was still, about $13,000 a year that they were spending on insurance and gas and all this other stuff. And then you look at the kind of alternative to that, folks who are able to choose to go car free. A lot of times when you have that choice, you live in a neighborhood that facilitates that, right? And in a lot of these neighborhoods, these kind of more centralized neighborhoods with amenities within walking distance and all this stuff, you're priced out of that neighborhood as well if you're the person who a lot of times depends on their car. And so it is kind of this damned if you do, damned if you don't, in it economically, right? And that is getting to that root of that system that we follow in the United States and a lot of places around the world as well. And that does take a lot of effort to be able to kind of get people to realize that you have to invest, you have to make public investment in this kind of thing to be able to take that burden off of the shoulders of the people that are feeling it. And so that makes me wonder, you just started the Nondrivers Alliance. Looking 10 years in the future, do you feel that your role in 2036 is going to be pushing policymakers to make those decisions? Is it going to be helping people elevate their stories? Is it going to be a combination of both? What would your hope be?
That's a really good question. It feels like the work we're doing is really evolving. We started out, with this sort of broader narrative change mission, right, of like making visible non-drivers, right? And especially, non-drivers by default, disabled and low-income non-drivers who really, don't have the option of opting into driving. And so using that, right, to begin to shift the narrative, but then shift and build sort of a community that can hold our elected leaders and decision makers accountable. And so I do believe in organizing, and so hoping that we can continue starting here in Washington State, to really sort of build a cohort of folks who are gonna hold our elected leaders accountable to making investments that we need to make our communities less car dependent. I am in some ways really hopeful in that I think there's a younger generation of folks who are questioning car dependency much more than even our generation has. and are really, really strongly interested in not having to pay for a car and not having to have that anxiety and stress in driving, and being able to live in a place where that isn't necessary. And so I do hope that that will help us shift political momentum. I do think, I mean, I'm less hopeful about the boomer generation, like people like my folks who are aging out of driving. There will be a lot of them aging out of driving, but I think for them sort of growing up in the era that they did, that a freedom associated with driving is so deeply ingrained that it's really challenging for them to imagine a world where they can have a full and wonderful life without driving. And so, part of this storytelling is perhaps aimed at reaching that generation of folks who are at the cusp of aging out of driving, because there will be a lot of people in the boomer generation who maybe can start to see themselves supporting and fighting for communities where they can continue to thrive, even when they can no longer drive.
Personal experience is such a huge motivator, right? And folks like that are kind of grappling with the idea of losing autonomy, I think that is definitely when they get that opportunity to learn and to grow, and to see that there are folks that have never had that autonomy. And those are also future allies. Most of your professional career, in one way or another, you have been advocating on behalf of people with disabilities and non-drivers. For the folks out there that are maybe our age, older, younger, it doesn't matter. There are people in their lives that are going to be either discouraged or afraid to go out there, put themselves out there, maybe to be the one nut who's coming to the city council meetings to talk about this stuff. What are some words of advice that you might have for someone who is looking to get into advocacy, in their community?
For me, having been in sort of advocacy spaces for a long time, one of the things that I have learned from people who have been doing advocacy work for, their lives is that you have to do it in a way that, feels sustainable to you. Because oftentimes it's easy to sort of mobilize around a crisis and, put a lot of energy and work really hard on something. And then, perhaps you win, perhaps you don't. More often you probably lose, and feel really discouraged and burned out. And so, for this work to really build and to build the sort of and grow the way we need it to, we need to be able to do it in a way that feels sustainable to each of us. And so, finding the joy in the connections you build with people, recognizing that even when you lose, that this work continues and needs to continue, and that bit by bit we are making change. And so I think that to me is something I would, yes, it's great to feel like a particular moment and build that sense of crisis around something that's happening, and trying to, get something to happen or get something not to happen. That feels really important. Like that's key. But also remembering at the end of the day that this is going to be a lifetime of work for all of us. And so doing it in a way that you can sustain, and doing it in a way that you build the relationships that sustain you, I think is really important.
That's a really great way of looking at it. I mean, because yeah, there will be failure in organizing. I feel like there's more failure than there are successes, but you have to live for those successes, right? And when I first started doing political organizing, one of the first campaign managers that I worked for, being a Seattle boy, I was a little gloomy, and he sat me down one day and he said that you really, even if you don't truly believe that this is going to work out, you have to tell yourself that it will. And you cannot work in politics, you cannot work in organizing if you don't believe that. And now I do. Now I always do. Now I'm like the cheerleader. And and I find that really interesting, right? Like that it is a slog, but it's very, very rewarding on those moments you do get these small victories, and you're going to celebrate those small victories. Well, I have one last question for you, and you kind of touched on this already, but what is one thing that does make you hopeful for non-drivers in the future? You talked about maybe the folks in the boomer generation coming around, but are there any, and the youth as well, folks younger than us who are embracing themselves a little bit more than folks in our generation? But are there any other things?
Actually, before I get there, I just thought of something else I wanted to say in the previous question. And that is, in this sort of way to make this work, sustainable for you for the long term, I think, finding also the parts of the work that feel like they align with what makes you happy, right? Like, I know, for example, like, testifying at public hearings, not my favorite thing to do. I mean, and I don't know if it's very many people's favorite thing, but like finding the pieces of the work that, like, for me it's writing, it's interviewing people, it's meeting one-on-one with people. Like, I love those pieces. I hate going to large events in a crowded room full of people and trying to network. Like, that is awful to me, right? I'm thinking of, a coworker, former coworker who is a wonderful artist and is designing some beautiful art for Week Without Driving, right? Like, figuring out the parts of, the pieces of you that you can bring to this, that actually, make you feel happy at the end of the day, versus like dreading having to do a particular thing. And we all have to do those things that we dread, right? In the work. No one, well, maybe some people enjoy invoicing, right? But like, there's or grant writing, like there's things that we, aren't, for me particularly enjoyable, that I still do. But then I really try to create space, and recognize that, the work is, I'm going to be able to bring the most to the work, by choosing the pieces and shaping the work around what, feels exciting to me in that moment. And that's my other piece of advice. As far as, hope, gosh, I mean, I do think, for me, it really does come from having these conversations with people. The conversations we're going to be having with non-drivers on this podcast, have for me been like wonderful, wonderful conversations as I've gotten to hear people's experiences, which, often are pretty different from my own, but then are similar in that, we've all grown up in communities that were really car dependent for the most part, and had to figure out ways to sort of hack it, to live the lives we want to live. And, the people that we're going to be interviewing here are people that really have, despite a lot of, barriers, made it work, right? And have figured out ways to stay connected and to have full lives. And yes, it's not perfect. And yes, there's a lot of things that could be better. But, showing that it is possible, even with our current infrastructure, even in places that aren't, New York City or DC or, San Francisco or downtown Seattle, where there is, transit, even in places that don't have that level of access, through a combination of things, it is possible to live as a non-driver, and live as a non-driver by default, right? An involuntary non-driver. And so I think that gives me hope, because even with as tricky as it can be, there are a lot of us out there making it work. And I think, part of, wanting to tell these stories is to make people feel less alone, and make more people feel like they can try it. Or that, if for whatever reason they can't drive anymore, cost or age or disability, right? That it's not the end of the world. Like, there are ways to make it work. If we push together, we can start to make it a little bit easier bit by bit, to the point where it isn't such a defining characteristic of our lives.
Well, thanks, Ona, for talking to me and kind of opening up a little bit, as we start this project. Personally, I think it's really, really worth being vulnerable about who we are, to show, that we're here and ready to listen to people and to share their stories in good faith. And so really appreciate this, and looking forward to our next couple of episodes coming up.
Thanks, Devin. Yeah, no, I think that what you said around being vulnerable, right? Like, we are asking people to share a lot. And so we wanted to put ourselves out there first. And we did. So now you get to know us, and yeah, we'll be back soon with more interviews and more stories. Thanks for listening to Non-Driver. I'm Anna Zivarts.
And I'm Devin Silvernail. If today's conversation resonated with you, please subscribe and share the show with a friend.
You can also leave us a review wherever you listen. It genuinely helps other people find the show.
Non-Driver is brought to you by the Nondrivers Alliance. Find more info at nondrivers.org.
And this episode was produced by Devin.
Want to get in touch? Email us at nondriverpodcast@proton.me.
We'll see you next week.